Is audio about to get more expensive? That is a question which a lot of people have been asking recently, as there's quite a bit going on at the moment, particularly in the United States, which has people uncertain, concerned, maybe even a little confused. And so today, in a slightly different video, I'm going to be talking you through some of the effects of tariffs, de minimis exemptions, and other factors, and how it impacts the price of audio gear that you buy. Brought to you by Headphones.com. If you like this kind of content and want to help support it, consider Headphones.com for your next audio purchase. And buy with confidence thanks to Headphones.com's 365-day return policy. Yes, it is going to get more expensive. Thanks for watching. But if you'd like to understand a little bit more about why things are likely to get more expensive in the near future, including products made in the USA, then don't click away just yet. For a bit of background, before I was in audio full-time, I worked in finance. I have a degree in economics, and so hopefully I can provide a bit of an economist's perspective on things. And I'm going to try and keep this as non-political as possible. I'm not going to be talking about whether any of these measures should or should not happen or debate the merits of any of it. I'm just specifically going to be keeping things simple and talking about how all of this is likely to affect the price of audio gear made outside the US, the price of audio gear made in the US, and how all of this affects those of us that don't live in the US. And whilst I would like to talk about the specific measures being imposed by the US government and the effects of those on audio gear directly, I've refilmed this video several times already, and things are changing on an almost daily basis, with tariffs being introduced and then walked back or delayed, measures being proposed and then never going ahead, restrictions being lifted, then put back again, and it's just hard to keep track of.
I'm tired, boss.
So let's keep things simple and talk about three things. What is a tariff, and what does it mean for products made outside the US for customers in the US? What do tariffs mean for US manufacturers, and why just buy American may not be the solution that some think? And what are de minimis exemptions, and how do they affect you? So what is a tariff? Well, a tariff is a tax imposed by one country on the imported goods and services of another country. And it means that if, for example, there is a 20% tariff applied by the US on all imported goods and services from China, then if I'm a US business or individual importing goods or materials from China, I have to pay a 20% tax on the value of those goods to the US government when I bring them in. The important thing to note here, though, because this is a bit of a common misconception, is that tariffs are paid by the US importer, not the country that the tariffs are actually being imposed against. A tariff is ideally meant to disincentivize people in the US from buying things from that country, but if they do so, it's not China or the companies in China that pays the bill, it is the US businesses and the US customers that pay that tariff. The most simple and straightforward effect of a tariff to talk about is what happens when a customer based in the United States buys a finished product from a manufacturer in China. And let's say the US is imposing a 20% tariff on all imports from China, and you want to go and buy a brand new pair of nice headphones. Well, you could buy this from a dealer based in China, and they will ship it overseas and straight to your door. But now, with this tariff, when it comes across the border, you are going to have to pay a 20% tax to the US government on the cost of that good. You'll pay, let's say, $1,000 for the product to the dealer, and then you're going to have to pay $200 to Uncle Sam. You could buy this from a US dealer instead, in which case you won't have to pay a tariff directly, but it's just because the US dealer has already paid that tariff when they imported the product, and that cost just gets bundled into the price you pay, it's just passed along to the customer. No matter which way you look at it, if it costs 20% more to get a product into the US and sell it, the price is going to have to go up by about 20%. And rather confusingly, if the tariff is 20%, the price may have to go up by more than 20% for reasons which we'll talk about shortly. But the main response that you'll see to this kind of thing is, well, if they're imposing a tariff on Chinese imports, I'll just buy American-made stuff, because then I don't have to pay any tariffs. But the problem is, American-made products are going to get hit as well, and also potentially could go up in price by more than the percentage points of the tariff itself. Let's work through an example to see how this works. I am a US manufacturer making digital to analog converters, and I make everything in the United States. But the ESS DAC chips that I put in my products, those are made in Taiwan. The aluminium that I use for my product chassis, that is largely imported from Canada. A lot of the electrical components that I use, the capacitors and resistors and such, those are made in either Shenzhen or maybe Japan. And the microprocessors and FPGAs that I use, those are made almost exclusively in Taiwan. So let's be generous and say that half of my components are not made in the US, and now are subject to tariffs of 20%. My product costs $500 in parts to make, And I also have fixed costs of $50,000 per month on the rent for my office, factory, and staff salaries that I've got to pay for. And so when divided over the, let's say, 100 units per month that I sell, this costs me an additional $500 per unit in fixed costs. So in total, it costs me $1,000 to make each DAC. My company takes a 30% markup as profit. So we sell this for $1,300 to a distributor or dealer. And the distributor and the dealer that they may sell it to take a combined 40% markup for themselves, meaning the dealer sells this product to the end customer for $1,820. This new 20% tariff does mean that the cost of my parts is going to go up. Only half are not made in the US, so applying this 20% increase to half of $500, and in total the parts cost goes from $500 to $550. But also, my ongoing research and development costs have gone up since, again, parts are now more expensive, so we'll add another $50 to the fixed costs to cover this, and we're now at $550 parts cost and $550 fixed costs. Since the cost of our product is already going up, we're expecting to see a little bit of a drop in sales, because as things get more pricey, people buy less of them. That's economics 101. And let's say that this 20% tariff is expected to lead to a roughly 20% drop in sales. And this means that whilst our fixed costs for rent, factory, research and development and so on have not changed, we do now need to amortize these costs over a smaller number of sold units. So now we have to divide that $50,000 over 80 units, not 100 units, making it $625 per unit instead of the previous $500. Then we add back on that $50 for the additional R&D costs, and the fixed costs now come in at a total of $675. So we're now at $675 fixed costs, $550 parts cost, for a total of $1,225. Now let's recalculate, adding my 30% profit margin back on, and we get up to $1,592.50. Then the dealer and distributor markups of 40%, and we end up with a final price to the customer of $2,229.50. A 22.5% increase over the original $1,820, even though the tariff itself was only 20%, and I'm making my product in the US. So even though I'm a US manufacturer making everything in the United States, these tariffs are still going to impact me, and my customers are probably going to have to pay more because it's costing me more to make these products. These numbers are pretty variable depending on, well, how much of what goes into making my products is actually sourced from outside the US, which will vary a lot. Some companies will be able to get almost everything from within the United States, and other companies will have almost nothing in them that was actually sourced from within the US. And how much am I actually expecting sales to drop based on the amount that I'm going to have to put my prices up? Which, that's a particularly important factor to think about for US manufacturers that don't just sell within the US, because if I'm a US manufacturer, my main competitor is in Germany, selling in Germany and the UK, for instance. Their prices haven't changed, they don't have any tariffs, so they can produce goods at the same price they were before. But I, in the US, am having to pay tariffs on all the materials I'm importing to produce my goods, and so when I ship them out to Germany and the UK, my products are going to now have to go up in price, but my competitors don't. And that means that I'm going to lose out on sales outside of the US because my products are now more expensive in comparison to my competition. I could look to swap some of my input materials for local US-made substitutes and avoid the tariffs that way, but for a lot of them there might not be a US-made substitute that I can choose to use. Taiwan, for instance, makes the vast majority of the world's semiconductors, and so if I've got an FPGA in my product, I don't have an option to get one from the US. They are basically only made in Taiwan, and I don't really have any choice but to pay the 100% tariff being proposed on Taiwanese imports. And for my electrical components, all the transformers and capacitors and resistors, for example, maybe there are American substitutes that I can swap to, but they're probably more expensive, otherwise I would have been using them already, and in fact, those and the American suppliers that I probably was already using for some of my components may go up in price, because if those capacitors that are being imported from China are now getting more expensive, the American suppliers are going to go, well, I can put up my prices now. I can put up my prices and still be a little bit cheaper, so you're still going to buy from me and I'm going to make more profit. No company's going to just leave free margin on the table, so even the products where I'm not paying a tariff, it is quite likely that they're going to go up in price as well. And the overall effect is, it's going to cost me quite a lot more to make my product. Regardless of if you are buying things made abroad or made in the US, unfortunately, if you live in the US, things are likely to get more expensive in the near future. And if you're a US manufacturer, your costs are likely to increase, both on a lot of imported and on a lot of domestic materials. There are some manufacturers which may be able to absorb some of this cost themselves. If the tariff is only 5 or 10%, a lot of manufacturers might say, well, we're willing to just eat that. We'll just take it out of our own profit margins and try and keep our prices the same for as long as we can. But if the tariff is larger, if it's 20%, that's probably not going to happen. If it's 30%, you are going to see a price increase. And this is also a bit of a concern for products which may have already been dealing with tariffs, because for Chinese goods in particular, there are already tariffs in place. But a lot of products didn't actually have to pay them because of something called a de minimis exemption. A de minimis exemption is taken from a longer Latin phrase which translates to "the law does not concern itself with trifles," and this is not referring to the dessert. Essentially, the government doesn't want to waste time processing and charging tax on the tiny stuff that you bring in. They don't really care about collecting $2 on the $20 IMs you bought, and so the de minimis exemption exists, or rather, it did exist. The de minimis exemption for goods below $800 meant that you didn't actually have to pay any tariffs on stuff that you imported as long as it was low enough in value. So you could go and buy a topping A90 imported straight from China to you, and even though there are tariffs being applied against Chinese imports, you didn't actually have to pay anything because the value was low enough for the unit to qualify for a de minimis exemption. But the US has announced that it will be ending the de minimis exemption. Since this announcement, it has been delayed, but as of recording, it still seems that at some point this change will go ahead, and this means that these goods will now be subject to any tariffs that may be put in place. This all primarily impacts people in the United States, and we've already seen some things happening even outside of audio, like the new NVIDIA generation of GPUs, for example. We've seen an increase in the MSRP since launch just a couple weeks ago due to these tariffs in the US, but outside the US, the prices have remained exactly the same, assuming you can get your hands on one. So for those of us outside the US, are we going to see price increases, or are things going to stay the same? Well, for the most part, for now, they should remain roughly the same. If I'm in the UK buying something from Germany, there's no change in tariffs between these countries, no increases in cost of production for that German manufacturer, even if they are importing things from China, because there's no additional tariffs being imposed. So there's not really any reason why prices should go up yet. The US has announced that it plans to apply reciprocal tariffs against a large number of countries, and that could change the equation somewhat. If the US starts applying tariffs against German imports, even though I'm in the UK, I don't have to pay any of these tariffs, that German manufacturer is now seeing a drop in sales in the US, and so they now have to redo some of the maths we talked about earlier, re-amortizing their costs over a smaller number of units sold, and that's going to increase their cost per unit sold. And they could just apply a price increase just within the US to try and account for that, but they might work out that actually, rather than doing a 20% price increase in the US and killing sales there pretty hard, if they did a 10% price increase in the US and a 5% price increase in the rest of the world, that actually works out slightly better for them. So even though we're outside the US, it is still possible that we're going to see some smaller price increases, though it shouldn't be anywhere near as significant as those in the US. The main increases in prices that those of us outside the US are likely to see is for American-made goods. US manufacturers are going to see higher costs of production, and so those products are going to cost more both in the US and when sold outside the US. For other products made outside the US and sold outside the US, prices should remain pretty similar, and for things made in China and sold in the US, like IEMs and DACs for example, even though we don't have to pay the tariffs, we may see price increases from the manufacturer as they try to balance the books amidst this growing trade war. There's a lot happening at the moment, and the truth is we don't really know what measures will stick around and what won't. But the overall summary is the price of goods imported into the US is going to increase. US-made products will get more expensive to produce and will therefore cost more, and prices outside the US may also increase, but likely by smaller amounts. So it doesn't make me happy to say it, but yeah, audio is about to get more expensive. I can tell you that Headphones.com has already received instruction from several manufacturers to put up the MSRP of their products, and there's only going to be more that follow. So if you were planning on making a high-end audio purchase, now might be a good time to do it. Hopefully, whilst you may not have been happy about that video, at least you've enjoyed it and found it useful. And if you have any questions about this or anything about audio, music, or gear, come and say hey on the Headphones.com Discord or the Headphones.com forum, and I and other wiggly ear enthusiasts will endeavour to help. I'm GoldenSound, you're watching The Headphone Show by Headphones.com, and I'll see you next time.